Hello, thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be exploring the quick menu for the Nikon Z50. Here we go. Welcome back. So this is part 2 of our exploration into the quick menu for the Nikon Z50. We are going line by line through the quick menu for the camera, looking at every single option we can select and when we might make one selection as opposed to another. If you just clicked on this link, please do know that this is a 2-part series and this is part 2 of that series. So there is one more video that we've already done on the first several options inside of the quick menu for the Z50. If you haven't seen that, check that out first, because we are going through them in order. And so as always, everything that we do here is brought to you by Camera Lessons Online, and what we believe is something very simple, and that is that everyone should have the information that they need, and it's not difficult, in order to be able to create fantastic visual art with cameras. And to facilitate that, we have the instructional videos here on YouTube. We have a 4-hour introduction to photography class on the website, and we have a couple books on macro photography and travel photography. I encourage you to go and check them out. Without further ado, here is the remainder of the quick menu for the Nikon Z50.
So next we're going to be getting into 2 sections that have to do with the focusing system of the camera, what's called autofocus area mode, and then the autofocus mode itself. The autofocus area is asking basically where it's going to look to figure out what to focus on, which is really, and this might seem like splitting hairs right now, but as we understand the nuances of focusing systems, it's important. Deciding what distance to measure is actually what the camera is doing. It's picking a point and measuring the distance to that point and then focusing to that distance. And that's actually the way that focusing operates, is we focus to distances. Not important as we start working with our camera, but start thinking of it that way, and it's more useful the more that you know about photography. So notice that I'm in AFC mode right now at the bottom right, autofocus continuous. The reason is you get more autofocus area options in continuous mode than in AFS, because in continuous mode we need to be able to track subjects or try to follow subjects and continuously focus on them. All right, so let's get into autofocus area, and we're going to have 5 options here. And the idea is going to be this. You have these points that we call crosshairs, and we can use them to figure out what to focus on. As we scroll through the 5, we're going to be trading off the number of crosshairs we have. The fewer we have, the more specific we're pinpointing, to our ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. So think of it as a balance between specificity and adaptability. I think that's the best way to think about focusing areas. So let's get started here. And we're going to start with single point, and that's going to be one crosshair that we work with. All right, one small crosshair. And when we select that, we're going to be able to navigate that through the frame. A dynamic area is going to have one point, but an expanded area around that. So if it doesn't find any information at the center point to be able to focus on, for instance, just a monochromatic white or black wall or part of a shirt or whatever, it can expand to crosshairs surrounding that middle point to find something with contrast to focus on. So it expands that point outward. Next, we're going to actually be dedicating an area. And that area is going to have crosshairs inside of it. And we get to decide only the area that's going to be used to find focus. And the camera has permission to use any focusing point inside of that area. Now, these wide areas, small and large, that's what the S and L stand for, those are going to give you the ability in autofocus continuous to follow moving subjects and focus on them without tracking. I've used these wide area modes to follow birds in flight with Nikon cameras before, and it can be a very powerful way of following and quickly adjusting to a subject that's moving fast. Imagine trying to follow a bird in flight with a single autofocus crosshair. It's a fast-moving subject, and if that one crosshair isn't on that subject, you're going to miss focus. So a wider area gives you some flexibility to follow fast-moving action. If I use a smaller area, I've got to work harder to keep it on a subject, but I have a greater likelihood that the camera will focus appropriately. By trading off to the wide area large, I have a larger area. It's easier to follow the subject, but the camera has more of a latitude to make a mistake. I would use area wide if I was following a bird with the sky as the background, but I would not use it if I was following a bird more eye level with a lot of trees and other objects as the background. So really, it's going to be background that helps me out here. Now, let me show you what this looks like. Okay, so this is our wide area, and it's pretty big. We see it highlighted in red, and I would just follow a subject and keep it inside of that area itself to keep trying to maintain focus on that moving subject. Let me change our drive mode here because we really don't want to do that. Okay. So now autofocus area is where the camera is going to figure out, based on the entire frame, what should be in focus. But two things become useful in autofocus area. The first one is our face detection and eyeball autofocus, where we can really let the camera prioritize the exact human face that we want in the eye of the human face. And the second feature is if we go into this is where subject tracking is. Now, subject tracking has to use the entire usable area of the frame in order to be able to follow subject that could move anywhere inside of the frame. So the camera's making the total decision, but we get access to new features. If I use wide area, small or large, I'm not actually tracking in a technical sense the subject. I have to actually keep the subject inside of that wide area. Both of them can work for action sequences, and they're worth experimenting with both, but know that there is that difference between them as you're working. All right, so this is a small area here, so you can see that, of course, it's smaller than the large area. No surprises there. So if we go in and go to autofocus single shot, we're going to have a different selection of choices in our focusing area. So let's go in and take a look at that. All right, and so now notice we have no dynamic area. We actually could not select tracking if we wanted to. Well, it can't constantly adjust focus with tracking. But now we have this smaller focusing crosshair called pin on the left, and it's a very small focusing crosshair that's actually only available to us in AFS mode. I want you to see it. It's the smallest crosshair that you can select in this camera, and we could move that to be very specific about where we focus in a portraiture situation or a landscape situation. And of course, we can navigate that and move it anywhere that we want in the frame. And then we're going to have that single point we had before. We do not have dynamic area. We still have the wide area, large area, and an auto. So now we're going to get into the autofocus mode. We have four options: AFA, AFS, AFC, and manual focus, MF. And some of these are useful, some of them are not, and we're going to break them down here. And when we might use one versus another. So I'm just going to tell you to not use AFA, or autofocus mode auto switch. So what it stands for there, as you can see. And this is where the camera has permission to decide if your subject is moving or not. It really confuses lenses. Lens manufacturers actually really dislike AFA mode. Your camera has permission to change focus on you without further input from you. I really dislike this mode. Most photo instructors dislike it and tell people to not use it. Instead, we say for non-moving subjects, AFS lets you lock focus, which is great. And for moving subjects, AFC, or autofocus continuous mode, lets you continuously adjust focus with moving subjects. And those are the only two autofocus modes that you should use. I agree with that sentiment entirely. When I'm doing night photography or some video, I'll go into manual focus, and that's going to be our last option there. So AFS, let's do just scrolling around, is going to be, of course, for non-moving subjects, and it allows you to lock focus by pushing in that focusing button and then hold that focus distance as you reposition the camera. Autofocus continuous doesn't do that. It's constantly adjusting. So if I move the camera after pulling focus, it might readjust, but I'm expecting that because I'm following moving subjects in this particular case. For night shooting, for some video shooting, I love manual focus. I do it for several of those types of instances. All of my astrophotography images are manually focused. So this gives you the easy ability to adjust that there. Next, we're going to talk about the stabilization, which Nikon calls VR or vibration reduction. And we're going to have three options inside of here. So let's take a look. We have off, on, and sport. That's what the SPT stands for. So let's go through them. Off, we turn a stabilization off in two circumstances. The first is if we're on a tripod, because then the camera's not moving, there's nothing to stabilize, but it's still trying to, and so the camera might actually try to stabilize for the movement of our subject and blur our shot. It's possible. The second reason that we would turn off stabilization under normal circumstances is if we have a shutter speed higher than about a 1/2500th of a second. In those circumstances, one, we don't need stabilization. The shutter speed is actually stabilizing the action, and it can actually work against our stabilization, and so we would turn it off. Most shooting, handheld shooting, we leave stabilization on because those are pretty extreme circumstances when we're shooting 1/2500th of a second or faster. But sport is a little bit of a different circumstance, and this is when we're following action because the stabilizer moves the optical element in the direction of the motion, or actually counter-opposed to the direction of the motion, but along that same axis. So if I'm panning with a moving subject, for instance, if I'm following a football player, in that circumstance, I might actually move the camera and blur my own shot with the stabilization turned on. So sport knows that the camera will be moving and knows to turn off the axis of stabilization in the direction of the movement. So that's what sport is. Very useful in those very dynamic circumstances. So fast-moving wildlife or sports, we definitely want to go to that particular stabilization mode. But we're going to be in the normal on the vast majority of the time. So next is going to be active delighting. This is our auto enhancement. Not a lot to get into here, but just a caveat, and that is that we want to make sure we don't over enhance anything because it can, like with other things we've talked about, start to look a little cartoonish. So auto decides how much how much enhancement we're going to do. Off, of course, we'll turn it off, and then we have increased amounts of enhancement. Extra high, high, normal, low, and then off. Don't over-enhance your images, particularly if you shoot JPEG. There's very little capability of pulling it back and making it look more normal. So leave this at normal or low almost always. I have used it in auto mode, and most of the time it's been just fine, but that's because in auto it keeps it closer to normal or low. It doesn't go into those extreme high amounts of enhancement regularly. Next, we have metering. Now, metering is how the camera evaluates light when it makes a recommendation for exposure. So, for instance, if you were in aperture priority mode, the camera decides shutter speed. It's your metering mode where the camera evaluates light in order to decide what shutter speed to select. The camera will meter in every mode in the camera with every picture that you take. And this is how it evaluates light. All right, we're going to have several options, and let's get into them. So think of it this way. If the camera is really evaluating the entirety of the frame, it's not specifically accurate to any one point within the frame. But as we shoot a series of pictures, each one of them, the camera reevaluates light in between, there's going to be very little change between those pictures. Even a series of 20 or 30 photographs, as the camera moves slightly, will not have significant differences. As we evaluate, ever smaller percentages of the frame will be more accurate to those smaller percentages, but over a series of pictures, we'll get greater fluctuation. So think of that as a paradigm that we have to place ourselves on. Matrix metering is where the camera evaluates the entirety of the frame, but does place emphasis on the point of focus. So this is your most averaged type of metering. The next option is center-weighted metering, and that's going to be where the camera ignores point of focus and places a significant amount of its decision on the middle 25% of the frame where it evaluates light, and a little bit of its decision on the surrounding 75%. And in this way, we have weighted the center of the frame more heavily as we decide exposure. My camera is actually set to center-weighted metering pretty much exclusively, but don't take that as a recommendation for anybody's shooting habits. I shoot exclusively in manual, and the only thing my metering system is doing is running my flash system. And when I'm doing a flash system, I'm shooting a portrait, and if I'm shooting a portrait, the people are in the middle of the frame. Until we're working more manually, we do need to pay attention to our metering mode. Typically speaking, landscape images are shot in matrix, people's pictures are shot in center-weighted metering. Spot metering is where we meter just a very specific point inside of the frame, usually the point of focus, and we're going to pretty much ignore the rest of the frame. So we'll get wild fluctuations throughout a series of images, but we should be more accurate to our point of focus. This is really something I only have ever used in extreme lighting conditions, for instance, shooting holiday lights, of course, at night with a really dark sky. So I don't like to have an evaluative metering mode or even a center-weighted metering mode because it will be averaging too much of that black nighttime sky. Now, spot metering is trying to find an average point or what should be exposed properly. This next option over is spot metering for highlights. And whatever we meter off of, we're telling the camera is a highlight, not a midpoint. And you're going to find that the camera exposes darker in this metering mode. And this is done to make sure that if we're shooting a landscape with a bright sky, that we don't overexpose the sky. That's the main time that this particular metering mode is used. So you will find yourself in matrix and center weighted the vast majority of the time. Next, we have our image size, and this is our resolution count. We have a 24 million pixel camera, but we can shoot at different resolution sizes. Medium would be about 12 and small would be about 6 million pixels. And you can go through and select those different sizes. Personally, I would never do that. I would always shoot at my highest resolution, and then I would shrink that down in post-production if I wanted to later. It used to be that we said that if somebody was going to shoot images and then just send them to a client, whether a real estate client or a portrait client, that then they might have a small JPEG option. But today, since we can send small versions of images over to our phones that are based on a larger image still on the camera, I would never shoot anything but large here. That's just my opinion. So next and last is going to be white balance. That's how the camera adjusts to the color of light that it sees. And we're going to have several options in here, but I would start earlier rather than later, getting into the habit of making white balance selection choices. So let's get into it. First, we have auto, and please notice that we have this down arrow, so we get to make customization again. And then we're going to have these icons where we can tell the camera what general kind of light we are in, and at the end, we'll be able to actually customize our white balance to the circumstances around us. But we're not going to be dealing with customization of a white balance in this video. That's something I've actually dealt with in a series that I made on shooting real estate photography, so take a look at that if you want to learn more about customizing white balance. Here, I just want to introduce the topic and the basic presets, which I find very useful. So we have our auto, and if I go into this, I actually have three options for auto. So the first one is trying to keep an overall atmosphere to the way that it looks. The second is knowing that we're trying to keep warm tones specifically. And the first one is actually trying to make white truly purely white. But if I go into one of these, notice that they had down arrows as well, I could customize the way that I wanted this to default. Now this little color patch that we're seeing is actually the way that we think about color shifting in photography. You have what's called your Kelvin, that's your left to right axes, and you have what's called your tint, which is green to magenta. So this is where we can adjust color as it shifts around in photography, and we can choose to adjust for these colors as we desire to. And so we could actually take our control pad and start moving this around, and it will change the way that we process color, and you can see that in the background image. Now, I actually don't ever take the time to do this specificity, and it's not because I don't want really accurate color, it's actually because it's easier to do a custom white balance rather than selecting off of this 4-quadrant graph. So that's my kind of way of approaching it. But we have these 3 options in auto, and we can customize each one of them in whatever way we wanted. I do like to keep white looking white when I'm doing a white balance, and so I tend to be here, and if I want to pull warmer colors out in post-production, then I do so later on. If you're shooting JPEG images, you might need to make a selection for warmer tones here, since you have less editing latitude later on with your JPEG file. So auto will always be a little bit inaccurate. And the reason is it's taking just the color it sees in the frame and then averaging that together and correcting for it. And if you just have a whole lot of blue or green or whatever in the frame, it will create a correction that neutralizes what's actually supposed to be a bold color in the frame, and you lose saturation out of your file. So instead, we like to use these presets. So we have a sunny day that still tries to create a natural look and feel, right? Still trying to turn white into something closer to white. We have customization inside of that one as well. In fact, we have in all of these. Direct sunlight, which tends to allow for warmer tones from direct sunlight. We have a cloudy day option. We have a shade option. And by the way, notice the background is warmer here. A lot of reds and orange kind of tones have been added in. Shade cools down the color of the light that passes through it. So to compensate, the camera's adding warmer tones back in. So what you're going to find is that the opposite color gets added in with each of these preset selections. So now we have incandescent bulbs. And actually we have fluorescents. Notice here that it says number 4, which is the most common color of fluorescent. They actually have multiple fluorescent tubes that you can choose from to correct for them. And so there's several options inside of there. The next one is if a flash is the predominant light source. Next is the Kelvin. Remember us talking about how one direction was the Kelvin color temperature, really going from yellows to blues. The other being tint, which is greens to magentas. And this is where you can actually select the individual Kelvin. Just like with the 4-quadrant graph, I do not ever tend to do this. Instead, I default to doing the next option if I want to be very specific in color, which is a preset where I actually take a picture of a 18% gray cloth and I preset the camera to exactly the color temperature in front of me. Right now, the video I have that discusses that is dealing with real estate photography and correct color, so go and check that out there. For right now, getting into the habit of choosing one of these presets when they're appropriate rather than auto will get you thinking about color and color accuracy early, which is a really great habit to be in to get the best images that you can create. So obviously there are a lot of menu options inside of the Z50, but this quick menu is all of the really essential things that you need to start being successful. And you don't really even need all of these. I turn my image quality to one setting and I never touch it again. I take my picture control and I set it to one thing. Now for JPEG shooter, you might have to change it more often. Select your degree of enhancement, and really, you almost never need to touch that again. Stabilization, you change very, very rarely. Flash would be something we start touching only with portraiture. And so white balance, the drive mode, and the focusing mode are really the things that you're going to spend the vast majority of your time on. Get comfortable working with those, and everything else in the camera can just kind of take care of itself, at least for a while. I hope that this has been useful going through the quick menu of the Z50. Hope that you check out the other things that we have both here on YouTube and on the website, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.